Welcome to the 14th episode of The Right Cast. Now, we are going to be talking about something that is very meaningful. And by the end of this episode, the message will be very clear. Or will it? Does it have to be? I don't know. But that's what we're here to discuss because something I've pondered quite recently is whether or not a story needs to actually have a meaning or a message to be, well, meaningful. And the reason why I was thinking about that is because I think maybe a month or so ago, maybe a couple months, I saw someone who is very passionate about storytelling and writing. They're a games critic, and they basically said in one of their videos that they feel like they would like to write a story and they don't want it to have any meaning or any type of message in it. And people in their chat were basically arguing with them, saying, "What's the point? That's impossible. You can't do that." And I just thought, that's an interesting discussion to have. I actually would genuinely want to know what people think and also have the discussion with you, Anthony, and just kind of have a dialogue about that because I think that's something that's, worth thinking about. And to be honest, somehow throughout all these years of me learning the craft, I never really thought about it. So again, thought it'd be worth discussing. So, Anthony, is there anything that you want to say just to open? Like, what do you feel about this topic? Do you feel like it's something that's, you know, really that important to think about, or is it something that you feel like most writers don't really need to worry about?
I think it's actually something that writers should worry about more than ever. We've kind of labeled this episode as discussing whether stories need a meaning or a message. Where
Mhm.
you're going to really see this pop up is a lot of people are having a discussion of whether stories should have politics infused with it. Should stories have a specific agenda infused into it? And so they're different labels, but they all boil down to the same thing. And you just have to look on Twitter or any online discussion forum, and you realize now more than ever, this is a topic that people seriously care about.
Yeah. So for yourself, then, how much would you say you care about it personally?
So I don't care about it too much per se,
Hmm.
but it's also because my stance. A lot of people they try to argue that you can make a story without a meaning or a message, and my counter response is that's actually impossible. And we'll go into that more in this episode. But again, it's kind of like saying you're writing a book without any words.
Mm,
It'd be really interesting to see you try, but I don't think it's going to go that well.
yeah. Yeah. So I think basically that it's an interesting thing to think about because when you're starting out writing a story, even if you're not new, you might just be sitting down to make a brand new story, just a new, or trying out a new genre, making just a new, trying a new medium or whatever. And you may just come to, you might start asking yourself, okay, how should I make the story different from the other ones I made? Or how can I craft my very first story? And what you might ask yourself is, what's the theme? What's the message? And in the course of you trying to create it, you might struggle to find it. In fact, I can say right now, there's a story I'm working on that's new, completely different to what I've written before. And I've been trying to find the meaning in it, right? Like it does have a meaning, but it took me a little while to find what the meaning was. Even with my very first book, I remember the process for that when I was writing it, and I had a lot of these ideas, and there was a lot of concepts, and I was like, I know I want this scene to happen, and this is a cool character, and I want them, and I want this magic and this plot twist. But when it came to like this overarching kind of theme or the kind of heart of it, the soul of it, it took a while for me to figure out what that was, the thing that just kind of connected it all together, right? And it's funny because when that moment hits, I don't know what it's like for everyone else, but I'm assuming it's the same. It's almost like it clicks, like almost like a puzzle piece slotting into place. And it's like something in your brain just goes, that's it. Like that's the heart of it. That's what this is all about. And so it's interesting because as you say, it's like as if inherently in creating a story, that has to happen, right? Or it's like to say that you want to make something devoid of that, it's almost like you say you don't want to have a story with any words, or you want the story to have no heart in it. So it's an interesting thing, though, I think, just to think about because I'm the type of person where I don't like to ever say you can't do something if it's in a creative medium, even though I'm not the airy fairy type who thinks you can do anything. And I'm not like that. Like I am pragmatic and practical. But but I do like to see people experiment and try to do things, especially if they feel like it's not really being done very much. It's just that oftentimes I'm aware enough to know that if something's not being done very much, there's usually a good reason. Not always. We definitely can attest to that as people who like things that are a bit off kilter. But even then, even though I do like things off kilter, I kind of understand sometimes why they're not why they're not done. So so actually I do understand it. It's just yeah, there are definitely things I feel like, oh man, I wish I saw more of that. But yeah, in regards to just specifically like message, and that's another thing as well, just distinguishing between meaning and message. So I've kind of put both because I just feel like either one could apply here. But would you say a story needs to have a message? Because I feel like there's a difference between those things, like a story having a meaning and having a message. Because as you say, it kind of is going to have a meaning. And I think there's a number of reasons we can discuss for why that's almost certainly going to happen. But message, I think that one's a bit looser. And I think that one isn't necessarily required for a story. Like, especially not from your perspective as the author. I don't think you have to sit down and say, here's the message, here's the moral of the story, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear more how you distinguish between the two.
Mhm.
I'm still on the fence, and I can explain my position whenever you want me to. That inherently, your story is always going to have a meaning and a message.
Mhm.
Um, but kind of to piggyback off of what you said earlier, I think it's important to note that at least for me as a writer, I don't necessarily plan from the get go that this story is going to have this specific meaning and this specific message.
Mhm.
That's usually something that I realize later, like you said with your story, as I'm developing the world, as I'm developing the characters and their arcs. And then I start to realize this is kind of what I'm focusing a lot in the story. So I am now going to highlight it even further and try to provide an interesting perspective and takeaway on it. I'll say for example, my fantasy series that's on sale, uh, a huge message behind it is that you need to make peace with the inevitability of death, and that was not planned any that wasn't planned for the series until I was probably 80% done writing it.
And which just so the people know which book is that?
So that would be the Mercenaries Crusade.
Okay, let's pull that up. Let's pull that
Yep.
up. Let's make sure that people can see this because they need to check it out. Right. So we've got the Mercenaries Crusade. Look at these covers. Look at these covers. Of course, Anthony, hand drawn by him, of course.
Oh no. But if you go scroll left for a couple covers until you get to the first one in the series. And
Hmm.
so there we go. So I brought this up in a earlier episode of our podcast. But as you can see, the main character of the Mercenaries Crusade has dark skin. And so this is kind of going into my overall stance on why it's impossible to make a story nowadays without some sort of meaning or message, where nowhere in the Mercenaries Crusade, any of the four books, does the character's race matter. Like, characters don't think of him differently because of his race. There's never been slavery in this fantasy world that I've created. But simply having a dark skinned main character means I've taken a stance in the overall conversation where there's a lot of people are saying, well, a lot of modern fantasy is influenced by European fantasy, and European fantasy didn't have dark skinned heroes. Ergo, if we want it to feel like classic fantasy, they shouldn't have dark skinned characters in it. To which my stance is that's ridiculous. And so, even though I never call it out or highlight it or anything, simply having a dark skinned character is me taking a stance and sending the message. No, you can do a very classical fantasy story, but have a dark skinned main character.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I can't lie. That is one of the funniest, especially when they try and bring the arguments for sci-fi. That one's very hilarious. But it's in the future. But they died of a plague, and okay. So, like, I mean, at least they tried to give it a reason. That's more than some stories, I guess, but nonsensical. Anyway, so it's funny because like you say, you kind of have to have a stance. But this is the thing. So, um, I get what you're saying in the sense of like, especially to do with nowadays where you're gonna usually have people, you know, think like, oh, what's the message here, or what's the agenda? And something that is really annoying is how people will say there's an agenda in something, even if I don't want to say even if there isn't, because they're not wrong. A lot of stuff does have agendas in it, but like it's to the point now where because so many things do, it's kind of like even if it doesn't, it seems like it does, right? So for example, like what you just said, so because you put a character who's dark skinned, it's like, oh, woke diversity, like it include, like it's like even if you're not trying to do that, you're just trying to tell a good story, right? It's gonna seem that way, even though if you jump back 10, 15, 20 years when we weren't ultra sensitive around that specific same thing, you had a lot of stories that incorporate those things, and a lot of us just said, hey, that's cool. And the funny thing is, technically, those things were woke. They were woke. I mean, especially for the time. So they were woke. It was just that it wasn't you wasn't feeling the message as much, the agenda as much, because it was usually just confined to the work, didn't override the story and the characters and the development and all the rest of it. And you most certainly did not have these corporations, all these people literally shouting and screaming it off the rooftops as the primary selling point of their product. So yeah, so I guess like that's the reason why there's a sore spot around it. And the fact that we've brought it up multiple times through our podcast is proof of the fact that in this day and age as a storyteller is something that you do have to think about. And even if you do not want to think about it, people will think about it for you. And they will make sure that they pull up to your front door and tell you. I mean, not literally your front door, I would hope, because that's not good. But your story front door, your virtual front door, whatever. But yeah, I think in terms of like anyway to do with the distinction between meaning like meaning and message for me. So to me, meaning is something that can be done subconsciously, and you may not be trying to input a meaning, or you may not be thinking like about any specific theme or trying to create a certain pattern within the narrative, but it just kind of forms because of the fact that you as a human, when you as a person like are sitting down to write something, you are putting a piece of yourself into the story, whether you like it or not. It's your story, so you are going to be reflected, and there's no way around it. Like when I look at my protagonists, each of them is like they all harbor like pieces of me. None of them are me exactly wholly because I made them their own characters, but they've all got like a piece of me somewhere or an aspect of me. Even if it's just something that only shows up like 2% of the time, I can still see myself in most of my characters. Um, and so it's interesting that people and that's just me, maybe not everyone sees themselves in their characters, but I'm just saying for me, like I do. And that wasn't something I consciously did. So if someone sat there and analyzed my story and was like, he definitely consciously tried to create this, and it's part of the message between, like it's like no, right? That wasn't intentional. Now there are some things that I am trying to get across as a message. I can say that for myself, but that's me though. But I can pretty confidently say there are stories out there you can experience which don't have any deliberate message or anything, but meaning, they will have a meaning, because even if you don't put the meaning there, other people will put it there for you because they will project meaning, or they will find meaning in it. That's something humans do. Is what people do. This is the reason, like how people see human faces in clouds or in a house with the windows or whatever. Like it's just part of our nature to always see ourselves in things or to see meaning in something. So to me, that's what meaning is. Message is more like sit down and learn this. This is your lesson today.
Mhm.
Here it is. If you have reached the end of this book, you should know this by now, right? You got something like, the classic Aesop fables, Red Riding Hood, don't trust strangers, right? Because they could be a wolf that's pretending to be your grandma. The boy who cried wolf, don't tell lies, because if you do, then people won't believe you and the wolf can eat you, just things of that nature where it has a message, right? But the funny thing is that the meaning someone could get from these things might actually be different to the message. So, for example, in the case of Red Riding Hood, someone could start to derive a whole meaning from that that has nothing to do with the message because they look at it in some completely other way. Like they might start to see, well, actually, the wolf is kind of a victim, and maybe he's just protecting his territory because the humans have been trying to destroy his habitat. Like you know, someone could just find some whole other meaning in it that wasn't there and wasn't intended, and it's separate from the intended message. If you get what I'm saying, I don't know if
Yep.
I'm doing a good job of distinguishing them.
No, again, this is kind of a debate for a lot of people on how do you differentiate the two. I did like how you use the word subconscious,
Yeah.
where I have a close but not exactly the same definition for the two. Where when I talk about the meaning of a story, I'm usually talking about why did the story get made? What is the story objectively about? What are
Mm,
the elements of the story that have this defined interpretation by the author or by critics, stuff like that. And then the message is usually something outward, where if the meaning was what went into the story, the message is what comes out of it. What influence does it have on your audience? What is the outlook it wants you to have of the world after you finished it? Stuff like that.
yeah. So, would you say for you then, is there so because the discussion we really are trying to have basically is can you make a story, and I'm not even really concerned about can you make a story with or without it, even though I guess we can discuss that. um so I guess we'll just go over that first because
Yep.
the thing I would like to get to, I think we'll just gradually build off of it. So do you were saying that you think it's impossible, right?
Yep.
um and I guess we've kind of touched on it, but what would you say is your exact reasons for why you believe it's impossible to tell any kind of story without a meaning or slash message in it?
So this also ties into our earlier discussions about what is the role of the author in the work. Can you really differentiate the author from the work?
Hmm.
And to that previous discussion, I said no. The author is always going to have a reason for making something. Even if the reason is just, I'm trying to make as much money as fast as possible, there is still a reason why they made the story the way they did, why they crafted the world the way they did, why certain plot beats, characters, events happen the way they did. And so there's always going to be your meaning there because of that. And
Hmm.
then in terms of the message, because there's always going to be a reader's interpretation and how they feel, I believe there's always going to be a message because of that. The only way you can make a story that doesn't have a message is if your story is so dull and boring, it had no emotional impact on the reader.
Pretty much, yeah. Which I don't think is what anyone's hoping for. Who knows? Maybe there's some avant-garde storyteller out there that's like, no, I want no one to feel anything. But
And that's a message in itself.
yeah, exactly. So that's the thing is that why do you think that is then? Like I have my own thoughts on that, but why do you think it is that people will like I mean I kind of already touched on it, but why do you think it is that you can't really escape the meaning or the message? Like do you think there's some actual reason for why you can't get away from it? Because you said people put a message or see it there as well, and I said that as well, but why do you think that is?
So I think this actually ties into what we talked about in our last podcast episode, where the audience needs to feel like their time is worth it. They need to convince themselves that, oh, this great piece of literature, this video game, this TV show, movie, whatever that they engage in wasn't just a waste of my time. That they are somehow better for it, can see the world differently for it. There needs to be a reason for engaging with content beyond pure entertainment. Because if we just accept the fact that entertainment is just that entertainment, uh, we start to feel really guilty about how we spend our time. And
Yeah.
again, I think that entertainment does have a purpose beyond just taking up time, being fun, stuff like that. But I would definitely say there are better examples where you can clearly get a message and a meaning out of it. And there are certainly cases where it feels like we make a bigger message and meaning because we need to justify the time we spent with it.
Yeah. And that's the thing as well, is that it's like you could easily just end up in, that kind of like headspace of thinking, oh, there's no meaning to anything, and what's the point, and all that kind of stuff. But that's the thing, is that people are always going to naturally try to find meaning in it because they want to feel like their existence is meaningful. And like you just said, if they're spending their time in this existence with entertainment, especially a book or something really fictional and clearly far removed from reality, they need to feel like this is still something. And so I don't think most people will consciously sit down and be like, I must find meaning in this or else I am meaningless. But I think that they just need to subconsciously, they just will, their brain will do that. We all do it, right? It's part of this suspension of disbelief. Because I actually thought about this once. I was imagining like authors when they're at book signings, right? And I was really thinking about the fact that people will line up in queues for potentially hours, depending on how popular the author is, to just have the author, just to see them, and that may not last like anything more than like maybe even a minute, if that. And it's interesting because they'll do that to get that signed copy or whatever. And a lot of times it's not like they're trying to sell it. I mean, a lot of times it's like they genuinely want to have the signed copy, which I can appreciate and respect, especially as someone who makes stories. But I just thought about the fact that it's like they're all there excited about something that this person just imagined, like came up with. It's like when I think about like Harry Potter and how it took the world by storm, or Lord of the Rings, it's like these are just, I know I'm saying, I sound like I'm saying the obvious, but when I really think about it, it's just this fictional story with all these fictional people that do not exist anyway. There's no way you're going to go on planet Earth and find these people. They're not there, but for some reason they feel real to us. They feel meaningful. They feel like they're right here. Like when I watch anything to the Star Wars, while some things might annoy me, even that is coming from the love and passion I have for it, right? Like all of these things that we're so passionate about and that we care so deeply about, and they're completely made up. And I just think I find it fascinating, especially as a person who makes those things now. I just find it fascinating how much power that has to us. And that's why I kind of find it just odd why someone would even want to make something that doesn't have a meaning. Like it's one thing if you can't find the meaning in your work yet and you're struggling to find it, but to sit there and try to consciously say, I do not want meaning, or I do not want people to see a meaning. I have to wonder, what is the point of that? Like, why? And again, I think it's a exercise in futility anyway, because you're a human being and you feel emotions almost certainly, and so you will put that in there whether you like it or not. And again, even if you don't, someone who reads it will have emotions and they will feel something. But also, I think that it reminds me a little bit of something that I've always found kind of absurd. I don't know what you think about this. It's a really common sci-fi trope. Well, I say sci-fi, but really just fiction trope, where you'll have an antagonist, like a villain, and they're meant to be like some kind of, I don't know, grand being. The specific example I've always thought of with this, where it set me off, was when I was younger and I played Mass Effect, and you encounter Sovereign, right? This is the first Reaper you ever find, and it's like, okay, and then one of the things he tells you at the beginning of the game is like, you cannot comprehend what our plans are, right? And then you find out what their plans are, and I'm like, but I couldn't comprehend that. And I'm like, why do they always say you can't comprehend our plans? Like, like, I'm not gonna like to me, it's just the goofiest line ever, because it's like, of course I can comprehend your plan. What are you talking about? Like, I get it, but and maybe if the story was kind of trying to make a point about, it's the arrogance of, these advanced beings, they think humans couldn't understand, and but I don't think it's even that deep. I think it's just honestly a generic like villain line of, you cannot understand what I plan to do, and it's really just there to create more tension and mystery so that the plot isn't revealed straight away. But it's kind of just like, okay. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because it just reminds me of, like, it's just one of those things where it's just kind of like, what's the purpose behind, like, there's certain things in stories I'm just like, what's the purpose behind that? Why do people keep doing it? It's not so much as on a deep level as like meaning or message, but I think there's just different little tropes and ideas and commonalities that we're so used to in stories, and in a weird way it actually plays into our experience of it. I don't know if that's making sense. Maybe but yeah, it's in a weird way plays into how we interpret a message. I really feel like I'm not communicating exactly what's in my head right now, but I apologize. I am trying.
So I got a couple of things for you. So first,
Thank
I was laughing because while you were talking about that, I was
you.
trying to remember what the line was. But there's a very famous video game series for people who are interested in visual novels called the Zero Escape series.
Mhm.
And then in the last game in the series, it's now a meme at this point. But every time you run into the main bad guy and you ask him why he's doing all this, he always says the same line of "My motives are complex."
Mhm.
And yes, it's another example of when you finally figure out why he's doing everything he's doing, it's nowhere near as complex as he made it out to be.
Yeah, that's another way of writers setting themselves up for disappointment. Don't do things like that, man. Because I mean, you can if you want, but it's just like, at this point, a lot of people are so genre savvy. And I know we're kind of veering off the topic, but I actually think this is a good point to make, just for people who make stories. Like a lot of people these days, especially with all this content, are so genre savvy. They're so story savvy that at this point, being subversive is really, I would say, like the best way to go, because people are not dumb and they're so used to seeing all the tropes at this point that it actually has gotten to the point where if I made an antagonist, it would actually be more interesting to people for the antagonist to probably just be like, "Hey, this is what my plan is. What are you gonna do about it?" Like, like that's probably more interesting to people at this point. It's like, yeah, this is my plan, and you're still not gonna stop me. And I'm not like in the classic Bond villain, like, here is my plan, James, and I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to monologue. Not the evil villain monologue type of thing, but well, I guess it could be the evil villain monologue if they really know, like, I am going to win. Um, but it's yeah. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but it's just
Yep.
a funny thing. But yeah, to do with like again the topic of meaning. So something that I think is also worth kind of thinking about, and this is really more what I wanted to kind of get to, is can a story be good without a meaning or message? So, for example, what I mean by that is if you don't put a message in it. In fact, let's just think about specifically like the message thing right now, like or we could say the agenda or whatever. If you don't put that in your story, can that be today considered a good story? Do you think?
I think it's so hard where if you gave me a case study example of something that pulls that off, I could maybe make the argument. But just if I think about any of my favorite stories that I consider to be the greatest of all time, they all have a clear meaning and message to them.
Hmm.
Like the closest, um, I mean, it's just impossible. Where it's like I was gonna say maybe the first Knights of the Old Republic game, but there's clear messages of redemption is
The redemption.
good, heroism is good. And I was going to tie into my comment where the one argument I would make is that video games sometimes pull this off, but this actually annoys me, but makes other people happy. But I don't like games that are trying to tell a story and then have multiple endings.
Mm,
Because I feel it starts to undercut the meaning or the message. Because there's always clearly one ending that people call the true ending, where this is what the developers wanted you to get, and then the other endings are just there because it's more replay value.
hmm.
And so it's like you go to the Knights of the Old Republic 1, you get the dark side ending, then yeah, there's not a real good meaning or message to that game. And if you start to come up with a message, it's that you don't want to trust people, that redemption doesn't exist. That's not what you want to teach people.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when you mentioned Knights of the Republic. I was thinking anything that has like branching narratives and multiple endings, I think is going to be one of the closest examples you're going to find to something not having a specific meaning or message, because they basically were like, here. Um, but like you said, the issue is that there's always a canon ending. There's always almost a true ending. In fact, is there examples of things which don't have a true ending that do that, like multiple endings, but there's no true ending to it?
Yeah, so it's funny. So there was this little horror indie game that came out. I think it was either late last year or early this year, but it's called Signalis. It's
Hmm.
on Xbox Game Pass, so if you're subscribed to that, you can try it out through there. But it's on all the major platforms. But they deliberately went out of their way that it doesn't have a true ending. Like all four endings are equally dark and morbid. There is no happy ending to the game.
Okay.
But for me, I feel that hurts the story, whereas for a lot of critics, it actually made it better for them.
Hmm.
So it's kind of just depends on your perspective.
So then, would you say that's a story that doesn't have a message or a meaning then?
Uh, I would argue it does. The problem with Signalis is that it's more of an atmosphere thing. Like there is story to it, but the story is so nonsensical. We talked about logic last week,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of time travel, time loop stuff that makes zero sense when you try to apply it to this game. So that's another problem of I can't give you a meaning or a message because I can't even understand how your time loop system works.
Hmm. Okay. Well, it sounded. I mean, I haven't played it. Maybe I need to look into it. But it sounds like it's maybe teetering. That it's like maybe hanging out somewhere in that
It is
territory.
very much a. It is the closest thing to an avant-garde game that I played in like the last 5 years.
Yeah, sounds like it. So it seems like it might potentially be something more in that vein. I think that would kind of be the easiest way to avoid it is to just kind of because I think that's really where it the biggest roadblock for you if someone was aspiring to create something with no meaning, no message. I think the biggest roadblock is going to be your ending because within the ending, how do you end something that doesn't have a meaning to it? Because I think somewhere in the psychology of even deciding how to end it, somewhere within that you kind of come up with a meaning, even if it's not conscious. Like it's almost like you decide this is the right place there. But how do you decide that? You know what I mean? Like the kind of mechanics that we employ to even do that. It seems to me like on somewhere you're going to come up with a meaning, and that's where I think you're going to have the biggest issue. Because I think throughout the middle of the story, you can have people just do nonsense and meander, but you got to end it somewhere. So unless you just end it randomly, like just at the most random spot, like someone sits down at a campfire and they stub their toe, and then the story just ends there. It's like okay, I guess technically you could do that, but yeah, we're talking about if we're talking about a good story, I just maybe something comedic, right? Maybe like just something that's
But it's like
purely.
the best comedy has a meaning and a message behind it. But that also goes into a discussion about the nature of comedy.
Mhm.
Like the best definition of I've ever seen of this is the science behind laughter and how humor works is that you take something that is statistically improbable but still possible and then make it reality, and that's funny.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the time, I'm thinking, yeah, I just think it's probably very difficult to accomplish. And to be honest, I wanted to discuss it because I think it's interesting, but there's something just within my soul that's just kind of like, what is the like even it's like what's the point of you trying to make something like that? But I want to always try and you know give some level of thought to certain things that I think is interesting, such as that. But yeah, for me, I just think like same as you, there's no way you're really gonna be able to pull it off. And I think even if you go and aspire to do that, do not expect people to like it. Or at the very least,
Yep.
I mean, you could argue you should never expect people to like something, but definitely don't be upset if it's not if people don't think it's this amazing piece of work or the greatest story ever told because people want to feel something. And I will say this is what's funny about it, and I don't know exactly what those critics were saying about that game, but I have a feeling that the randomness of it led to a lot of people basically there's this thing I call the head canon technique, which is basically when and I call it technique, even though I don't know how many people actually use it as a technique. I just call it that. But it's basically this thing where people will make like really vague details that they're not really explained. Let's say like you have Star Wars, right? And so in Star Wars, like you could have something like with the Empire, they could have like the TIE fighters, and there's no explanation in films for why the TIE fighters look like that. They just do. That's the design of them. Okay. But another person could have tried to give you some really deep, extensive breakdown as to why it
Yep.
looks like that, and this is the reason. And if I ask the average Star Wars fan, why does the TIE fighter look like that? I'm sure a lot of them have got some headcanon they're going to come out with, right? Unless they, actually, I'm sure by now with the EU and there's probably an actual canon reason. But if you was to remove that, like back when the films originally dropped, I'm sure people made up reasons for all kinds of things, right? Why does Darth Vader breathe like that? Why is he in that suit? You didn't know why he was in it at that point. So people probably just made up reasons. And I guarantee that, you know, in them making those things up, some of them maybe got very attached to those ideas. Maybe they was like, yeah, that's definitely what it is, or no, that's really cool. Maybe when they found out the actual kind of reason, they thought it sucked compared to what they came up with.
So
But
I
yeah, go
got
ahead.
two. Oh, do you have
No, no, go
anything
ahead,
else
go
you want
ahead.
to? Okay, so I got two famous examples of this that
Hmm.
both of them are successful in their own way, and it's funny because of how similar they are. That'll help you understand why they tell their stories like this.
Hmm.
But the first is the Dark Souls series, and now Elden
Yes.
Ring. Elden Ring on game consoles does not have a good story. Elden Ring on YouTube has a great story. And what I mean by this is that when people say Elden Ring has a great story, they are either thinking about the story they made up in their mind or the story as it is told to them by a specific YouTuber and their narrative style.
Yes.
Because the fact that you can play Elden Ring, I can play Elden Ring, and then there's some random person play Elden Ring, and all three of us can have completely different interpretations of the story is both a strength and a weakness. It's a weakness in that we're never going to have the same experience. It's a strength in that it gives opportunities for all of us to enjoy the story and find a meaning and a message that is empowering to us on the individual level.
Right.
And then the other example I was just going to bring up real quick is Brandon Sanderson. There's our quota for this episode. But he loves to pepper his books with tiny, minute details that, in the grand scheme of things of the Cosmere, doesn't mean much. But the fans love it because it gives them an outlet in order to discuss theories, predict what will happen in future books, and ultimately gather together online as a community and discuss the series with each other.
Yeah. So Dark Souls was definitely the thing I had in my head that I was going to jump to, because to me it's the clearest example of this. But even there's a lot of books as well that do it, and I usually find it will be the first in a series that will do it, where the world building maybe isn't established and people don't know if it's going to succeed and yada yada yada. So sometimes that will be what it is, and it's less so in books because in books the entire story relies upon people understanding it. So you can't get away with that. Video games can get away with it because it's really about a game. Like, what's the story of Pac-Man? I don't know. Does it matter? No. But imagine Pac-Man as a book. You better have a story. Like you don't have no. There's none of that. You better make that actually make sense. So, um, it's it's interesting because to me, the headcanon type of thing that I'm talking about, like what Dark Souls does, as a storyteller, if you was to do that, what you just said is actually a very interesting thing because you can do it in books to a lesser extent, but it's like when you're vague about certain specific details, people will just make it up. Like, I don't know if you've ever played the Dragon Age games. I think you have. Um,
I tried the first one, lasted about 10 hours, was like, this isn't for me.
Okay. Well, in the Dragon Age series, like I remember in the very first game, there was like this place they kept mentioning called Orlais. You never see Orlais in the entire game, but people mention it, and it's just kind of this thing, and you can only imagine what it's like, but you never see it. And I think in games like Dark Souls, for example, it's similar where it's like here's some details, but it's like what is this thing, and you don't really know. And some of the things that will be described, there's not really a reference, so you don't necessarily have an actual canon image of it. It's more something you got to make up. And like you just said, that's where people get the meaning from, is making things up in their head as to what it means. And I find that interesting because when you leave that space for people, this is one of the reasons why, like for me, for example, I don't really describe like certain things in very minute detail. Like for example, characters' faces. Like there's some writers who will explain like exactly what a nose shape's like, and which I might do here and there, but that's not really on average what I will do unless I think it's worth pointing out. And one of the reasons why is because personally, I just don't really when I'm writing, I don't put enough emphasis on that. I won't care about probably what they're wearing or how they're standing or how they speak or something, as opposed to what their facial details are. But for some people, those minute details matter. But the funny thing is, the less of that detail you put in, the more people will project into the space that you leave. If you put enough details, for example, this is a perfect example actually of something that I struggled with. I used to always struggle with describing a room. So, like, if I had to describe what was in a room, I mean, like in my bedroom right now, there's all kinds of different things in here. If I was to write a book and describe my room, I feel like it'd be too much stuff. When I first started writing, I thought, oh, I need to put all these details, or no one's going to understand how it, like, they're not going to picture it properly. Um, but it's more like if I focused on just a few things, people will kind of fill in the rest anyway. Their imaginations are strong enough to do that. So I point that out because, again, when we're talking about meaning and stuff, that's kind of how I view it. Is even if you're being vague or you think I'm not going to do this, like we keep saying, people will put those things in there regardless. But what's funny about it is that it can be a technique. It can be a technique to try and be vague. It can be a technique to try and not make something deliberately meaningful, or to kind of allude to meaning but not actually give a meaning, if that makes sense. Again, like we were saying with Dark Soul, it's kind of like, there is this thing here, or there are these beings, and it's kind of like we'll allude to something, but it's, what it is more for you to kind of figure out and put the pieces together, you know. And I find that's quite interesting in and of itself. I think that's something that when it comes down to meaning in a story, maybe a bit of a roundabout way or a bit of a complex way of trying to approach it, but I do think that that's, again, something else to kind of think about. So but yeah, in regards to the message thing and agendas, don't do it. No, I'm joking. But,
Good luck,
but
I say.
yeah, I mean, okay, so I do want to ask about that then, just to kind of talk about that real quick. Um, do you think a story having like an agenda is necessarily a good or bad thing for it?
No, I don't think so at all. I think there are. I would make the argument that most great stories have a specific agenda. It's just they get called out a lot more now compared to how it was even 50 to 100 years ago. Because usually the agenda was something that the vast majority of the audience would agree with. Usually it was just pretty basic moral stuff where it's like murder is bad, cheating on your spouse is bad, don't steal from people, stuff like that. Even now, there are great stories where I go into it, I completely disagree with the moral agenda as presented by the show or movie, but I still walk away and say that was a good experience. I'm glad I watched that. Even like I think I brought up, the moral philosophy of The Last of Us is something I fundamentally disagree with. That was still one of the better TV shows I've seen in the last 10 years.
Hmm.
It's just for every The Last of Us, you can get 10 other examples where it completely fails. And I would make the argument is that usually it's pretty easy to tell what was the motivation and again, what was the message that the storyteller was trying to come up with. Where if your plan in developing your story is day one, I already know what my moral message is going to be. I already know what agenda I'm going to have in this story. Your story's probably going to turn out bad. I would say for especially new writers, don't worry about the message, meaning any of that until you've developed everything else.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, I was gonna say exact same thing, because I think basically it comes down to the inception. If your inception for trying to create a story, your initial motivation is I want to get this agenda out, then that is what is going to be the thorough line and what is going to basically fuel your work, and it is what is going to basically show up throughout most of it. Problem is that that is not what most people come to stories for. If they wanted that stuff, they would go to a class, they would put on a lecture on YouTube or something. Like, if that's, like, most people not coming, especially when it's fiction. I think that's a very, very important thing as well, is that if it's fiction and if it's speculative fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, these are things people come to for escapism. That is not to say they do not want to feel like it's relatable or that it is realistic or any of those types of things. That is what makes it powerful, is having those human experiences in it. But as we keep pointing out, those things will be there inevitably anyway, because you're a human being. You are not going to. This again goes back to the you cannot comprehend. No, I can comprehend your story, okay, because you're a human, and because you're a human, you cannot possibly create something another human cannot comprehend. It doesn't make any logical sense. Like, how can you, if no other human could comprehend it, how did you comprehend it? Right? So it's like it doesn't make sense, and that's why it's just nonsensical to even have a villain say something like you cannot comprehend. No, I can because you was made by a human. So yes, I will comprehend your plan. you know, and even if I don't, some human, someone will, and they'll make a YouTube video called, the Reaper's plan explained, right? And it'll be a 50-minute video with a clickbait thumbnail with a red circle and an arrow, and yeah. But anyway,
You'll give someone a few views at least.
yeah, exactly. So someone will break it down. Someone will do a whole breakdown video. But that's the funny thing is that, like, again, like, just to wrap it up, like, I think that in terms of like when people are imposing like messages, especially in agendas, the thing is that, as we've pointed out many times, and as many people online will tell you, focus on the story primarily, because the thing is, like, even the new story I'm making right now that I'm talking about, where I'm thinking, what's the meaning? What's the meaning? One thing that I kind of came to the conclusion is that I want to still have fun with the story. I don't want people to read this and feel like they're being lectured to. They feel like it's, but I want it to have a meaning, and I do want it to actually have a lesson as well in it. But I don't want you to feel like throughout the entire book you're being lectured to about this damn lesson, because I wouldn't want to read that. That's boring. That's dry. No one wants that. We get enough of that in our daily life. You know what I mean? So it's like, if we're going to sit down and create like fictional. Now, if you want to make something like that, that's fine. I just think you need to be prepared with some very realistic expectations that you will probably get completely obliterated by most people for doing that, because that's not what they want. But if you are going to do that, be very upfront that that's what it is. Don't be one of these people who tries to sell it as, this is a story about a fallen empire and the return of the magic and the dragons and blah, 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 blah. And then it's just this entire political treatise push for whatever social belief you have. Like, please don't do that, because it's annoying and you will get obliterated. And I will be one of the people who comes on here to obliterate. but yeah, so that's the main thing I wanted to say in closing. I mean, Anthony, do you have any closing thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, so to kind of comment on your point, my position on that is that there's no right way or wrong way to do it. The most famous example I can think of is the Chronicles of Narnia series. That is one of the best-selling series of all time, and that is clearly a story about Christianity, to the point that I've seen people call it like Christian fan fiction. And I wouldn't even necessarily say that they're wrong, but it works as well as it does because, number one, the main audience that it's intended for loves it. And number two, even the secondary audience, where it's like they aren't Christians, they don't approve of Christianity, they still get some enjoyment around it, because everything else packaged around the Christian elements is still great, and it's this unique original fantasy world. So
but I was gonna say, you see, that's the thing. So when I was a kid and I saw Narnia, I had no idea it was any Christian type of anything. I just thought it was a story about a talking lion, some kids, and like, and I think because the audience, a lot of it is children, they don't have that. You know, most kids are not walking around with all this political stuff in their head or all this religious. You know, unless, and now if they was raised like that, well, maybe, but even then, unless they were specifically told that, if you just found the story by yourself, I don't think you would think of it like that. So that helps as well, because most people, when they're little and their exposure to stories like that, it's like, oh, it's just this. See, for me, I have a soft spot for Narnia, so it doesn't matter. I mean, firstly, I wouldn't care anyway because I still think it's cool, but that's my point. Though, it's still cool. There's if Narnia was literally sitting there, and another thing as well is that it's using like other characters. It's trying to represent those things rather than actually be those things. So in a way, it's kind of masking what it's trying to teach you about, if you get what I'm saying. And I think that just that kind of 1 or 2 degrees of separation is enough for most people, where they don't feel like it's the exact same thing being thrown at them. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I would assume so anyway. For me, again, I didn't know what it was. And then secondly, it isn't a sore spot for me like it is for some people. So it didn't really matter to me even when I found out. In fact, that just made it more interesting to me. But yeah, that's all I've got to say anyway on this topic. I mean, if you've got any other final things you want to say?
I'm good.
You're good? Okay. Well, that has been episode 14 of the Right Cast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope there was meaning, and I hope you understood the message. The message is, do not be like us. Be yourself. No, I'm joking. Right? But thank you guys for watching, and we're out. Peace.
Ciao.